Let's get this. Good, great. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you all for being such fantastic hosts, especially Grace and DJ. I've really enjoyed my visit so far. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of the work that we've been doing on photonic processing for oxide semiconductors. Before I do that, for those of you who have not been to the University of Minnesota, just give you a little bit of idea where I'm coming from. University of Minnesota is not too dissimilar from Cornell in many ways. We have all 4 seasons. We have wonderful, beautiful winter, as well as a lot of natural environment to enjoy very near campus, which is one of the things that I love most about Minnesota. We're located in the Twin Cities with a metro population of about 4 million. We've got a great airport and a lot of restaurants, and it's a really fantastic place to live and a great place to visit. Our campus is about 50,000 students, and that's because we're one of the few universities that includes engineering, med school, law school, vet school, and agriculture all on one campus. So lots of opportunities for multidisciplinary work and collaboration. In my department, electrical and computer engineering, we have about 45 full-time faculty and about 400 graduate students. We have really close ties to a lot of the different companies and industries that are located in the Twin Cities, which makes it a really exciting place to work and to live. So if anyone is interested in a postdoc position, please talk to me, because I have a couple of open positions that are going to be starting that I haven't posted yet, but they'll be posted soon, and I would love to talk to you about it if you're interested in coming to Minnesota. So in flexible electronics, the word flexible can mean many different things, right? So I wanted to sort of set the stage for what I mean when I say that my work focuses on flexible electronics. So we have, traditional CMOS silicon that we're all familiar with, and then on this sort of trajectory towards flexible electronics, we have these hybrid systems, which are really just more traditional components that are placed onto a flexible or a stretchable substrate. So these sorts of hybrid systems can enable a lot of new applications, but what we're really interested in is getting to thin film and sort of skin-like electronics that look more like this. So not completely replacing all the functionality that you can get in CMOS, but rather taking advantage of the fact that if we make these devices in this form factor, we can interface those devices with the body in ways that silicon can't. And so that's what I'm talking about when we talk about flexible electronics. So in my research group, we focus on the materials and fabrication methods to make these devices. And we have some work that's on oxide transistors, and this is what I'm going to be focusing on today. And then, a lot of the work that's in my group is really not on transistors at all. And we're working on sensors. They're getting integrated into, biomedical sensing. And we have a lot of collaborations with everything from psychiatry to surgery to cardiology to emergency and trauma care to figure out how we can make different types of devices and interface those with the body to learn something new for medical applications. So I'll touch on a couple of those projects at the end if I have time. But what I wanted to focus on for this seminar is our work on flexible transistors. And specifically, what I want to talk about is 2 photonic processing methods that we've been using for these thin film transistors. So the transistors that we make are based on amorphous oxide semiconductors. So these are IGZO materials, if you are familiar with these indium oxide-based materials. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that, I'll give a short introduction just so that you can understand some of the processing goals that we have. And then I'll talk about 2 processing methods that we've been developing in my group. One is called photonic curing, and we use that to anneal thin films. And the key is that we're doing a high temperature process on the thin film, but the substrate itself can have a very low thermal budget. So we're not heating the substrate as much as we're heating the thin film. And that opens up a lot of exciting applications in flexible electronics. The second process uses a similar tool, but rather than curing a material, we're using this for a liftoff process. So it's very similar to a laser liftoff, if you're familiar with that, where you fabricate polymer films, build devices on top of that, and everything's done on a carrier wafer. And then you release that from the carrier wafer so that you can have a flexible device that benefits from having a rigid carrier when you're going through the litho. So I'll talk about those two, and then hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end to highlight a couple of the applications for flexible electronics that we've been working on in biomedical sensors. So to start with the introduction and the material part, you know, oxide semiconductors have been around for decades, but there was sort of this renewed interest in specifically indium-based semiconductor materials around 2003 and 2004, and it came. This was really spurred by two papers from Hideo Sono's group. The first was in 2003 in Science, where they made single crystal indium, gallium, zinc oxide. And they have this sort of superstructure where they've got the indium oxide layer and then the gallium zinc oxide layer. And using this material, they used PLD to sputter the film, and then they actually annealed it at about 1400 degrees to get this crystalline structure. Okay. And when they did that, they got a field effect mobility of about 80 centimeters squared per volt second and an on-off ratio of these transistors of about 10 to the 6. And this was, you know, an order of magnitude or two better than what had been achieved with most zinc oxide and other oxide work in the past. So this was really a game changer. And then the next year, the same group came out with an amorphous indium gallium zinc oxide material process. And they showed that when you make these films amorphous, you actually maintain a lot of the transport. So with silicon, we know that if you go from crystalline silicon to amorphous silicon, your mobility drops from a few hundred to maybe 1 centimeter square per volt second, right? So this is already 10 times better than amorphous silicon, but it has all the benefits of an amorphous film. So for those of you who you know, are more used to working with crystalline materials, amorphous films have a lot of benefits for very large area electronics because you can get a more uniform film over a very large area. So a lot of this interest was really pushed in for applications like displays, where you have a large backplane and you want to have uniform performance of your pixel transistors over that backplane. And making them film amorphous is actually incredibly beneficial. So here, this demonstration in 2004 showed that we could get 10 times higher mobility than amorphous silicon. Oops. I think we're okay. Good. And so the number of publications for IGZO and indium oxide-based materials since 2004 has just been like the hockey stick curve. So the reason that these are so interesting from a materials perspective, and I won't go into a lot of detail here, is that if we think about a covalent semiconductor like crystalline silicon, we know that the transport is happening through these sp3 hybridized orbitals, and so bond orientation is really important. And if you have disorder in the system, you go from a picture that looks like this, where you have all this nice orbital overlap in your sp3 orbitals, to something like this, and your transport just tanks, right? This is why amorphous silicon is so terrible compared to crystalline silicon. So IGZO is very different because in IGZO, the conduction band is actually formed from these spherical metal s orbitals. And so with zinc oxide, you have a 4s orbital. Indium oxide, you go to a 5s orbital. So it's a bigger orbital. And what happens is that as long as you can get good orbital overlap of those spherical 5s orbitals in the indium, the disorder doesn't really hurt you that much, right? Because when you have disorder, as long as you still have overlap, you can still have good transport through the material. So it degrades the mobility a little bit, but not nearly the same way that it does with silicon. So all of a sudden, we have this candidate for an amorphous material that is less sensitive to disorder and really, really interesting for large area electronics and for flexible electronics. So the other thing that's really interesting about this material is that we have this almost infinite space to play with in terms of composition, because IGZO refers to indium gallium zinc oxide, But the indium, gallium, and zinc are really playing very different roles within this material. So the indium you can think of being the mobility enhancer. That's that 5s orbital, and it's giving you higher mobility and tends to give you higher carrier concentration as well. The gallium in indium gallium zinc oxide tends to be what we think of as a suppressor. The ionic bond between gallium and oxygen is stronger, and so it tends to hold the oxygen in the film. And so you have fewer oxygen vacancies, and that way you suppress your total carrier concentration with gallium. And then zinc, it's a little bit less clear exactly. Zinc can play the role of the suppressor as well, but it also helps to make sure that the network remains amorphous, so that when we really don't want these materials to crystallize. And so by including either gallium or zinc, we can have this effect of controlling the carrier concentration, so we can actually have devices that turn off, and we can avoid crystallization as well. So playing with the different ratios of these materials is one way that we can really explore how to optimize their performance. And one way that we do that in my group in particular is using solution processed oxides. Now, some people, if you tell them that you're working on solution processing, they say, oh, that's cute and printing and, isn't that fun? But actually, solution processed oxides are really fantastic, even if you don't care about printing or additive manufacturing at all. We spin coat these materials. It is as simple as mixing an indium salt, like indium nitrate, with zinc nitrate into a solvent. Those salts dissolve, and you can spin coat a layer and then heat it up to 500, 600 degrees, something like that, and get a very nice semiconductor film. So we're actually exploring this to see how these films compare to something like the ALD oxides that a lot of people have been exploring. So the problem with these is that this salt gel method does require about 400 degrees or higher to convert those indium and zinc salts into the metal oxide form that you want. And so what we see when we look at, for example, XPS is as we heat this film from the as deposited film shown here in green, where you have this shoulder, as you increase the temperature, what we see is that the oxygen is going to be bond more, the oxygen is bonding more to the metal and less to a metal with a hydrogen. So as we increase the temperature, we're getting more of this desirable metal oxide and less of this undesirable metal hydroxide. Okay, so if we don't heat it enough, we're not going to actually get the semiconductor that we want. And the problem here is that the maximum temperature for a lot of plastic substrates is about 150 degrees. If you want to go with something like polyethylene terephthalate, PET, which is really cheap and really common. So then the question is, how can we cure a semiconductor film at really high temperature on a plastic substrate that doesn't want to go above 150 degrees? Okay, so that's where this photonic curing comes in. So again, these are two separate methods. I'll talk about the photonic curing first. So what I'm showing here is a glass substrate. And on that glass substrate, we have a small metal gate area. Okay, so this would be, for example, the bottom gate for an IGZO TFT. Photonic curing uses pulses of light from a flash lamp. So imagine the flash from a camera. That's actually how they started. They're short. They're not laser short, or pulse laser short. They're less than a few milliseconds. And you can heat the top of the thin film without damaging the low temperature substrate. And we do that by very carefully choosing our materials so that the heat stays at the top. So this is a xenon flash lamp that we use. So when this is illuminated, basically what we can see is we're going to look at the temperature as a function of depth into the substrate here, and we'll look at the temperature as a function of space around the substrate surface here. And what we'll see is we'll look at this temperature as a function of time during this pulse. So when the flash lamp turns on, the semiconductor and that is sitting on top of this metal gate is going to heat. Because as you can see, only the region where we have metal is going to heat up. So it's heating up very rapidly, but then as soon as the light turns off, it begins to rapidly cool, and that heat is sucked away into the substrate. And the temperature that you reach here is going to be a function of the absorption properties of these materials and also the thermal conductivity. But the key point that I want you to take away from this is that what we have here is a metal gate that's working as an optical absorber. And then essentially it's like a little microheater where we're only going to heat the area on top of that metal gate. So we get this nice sort of self-aligned aspect of this work as well. So if we take this cross section, and this is when this is what the temperature profile looks like as a function of depth into the substrate. So this is modeling a metal gate on a glass substrate. So you would have your semiconductor material up here on the top. And what we can see is that a very, very small portion of the substrate is reaching this very high temperature, but it very, very quickly drops off, and you've got this temperature gradient so that at the back of the substrate, you're sitting near room temperature. So this is the other key point that I want you to take away from this, is that the thin film is heated while most of the substrate below is not. So to use this to make our indium zinc oxide transistors, we make pretty big devices in my group. So this is a 60 micron channel length. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm stepping on the cord here or what's happening. So we make fairly big devices. This is a 60 micron channel width here. And the stack looks like this. So we're working here on glass substrates. We have a molybdenum bottom gate. That's a really good absorber. And it doesn't reflect the light. So we can absorb about 60% of the energy from that xenon flash bulb. Then we use a hafnium oxide gate dielectric, and this blue layer is our indium oxide semiconductor. And when we do the curing, we do it without the source drain in place. So here I'm showing those top source drain, but those would not be there when we do the curing. So one of the things that we found out very quickly was that a lot of the early work that we'd seen from some other groups in this space used aluminum as the bottom gate. Well, it turns out aluminum is a wonderful mirror and a really bad absorber. And so what we showed in some of our early work here is that if you use aluminum as your bottom gate, you are absorbing very, very little of the light. And as a result, the temperature that you will reach on the surface is incredibly low. Most of that energy is just getting reflected. And so by choosing a bottom gate that is an excellent absorber like molybdenum, with the same flash pulse, we are going to see a temperature of around 500 degrees instead of a temperature below 100. So first choice, you have to choose your materials wisely, right? The second choice of material has to do with the substrate. So here, I'm showing a molybdenum absorber layer, and we're looking at the substrate as being either silicon or glass. A lot of the early work here was done on a silicon substrate with an aluminum gate. And what we're showing here is that because silicon is so thermally conductive, it sucks the heat away, and you don't actually heat up the top surface of your film. So with the same pulse and the same molybdenum gate, you can reach about 500 degrees if you have it on glass, and you reach, again, only about 100 degrees if you have that molybdenum on silicon. So you have to structure your devices with intention so that you can take advantage of this photonic curing. If you do that, the tool that we use has incredible precise definition of the time that the lamp is on and off, so that we can do what's called micropulsing. So we can do a single pulse where the lamp turns on, the temperature comes up, and then when the lamp turns off, it comes back down again. And what we're showing with these different colors is the temperature at the top surface, just below the metal interface in the substrate, and at the back of the substrate. So again, that green line is basically showing you that you're barely heating that the back part of that substrate. But you certainly are heating up right below the metal. So this is an example of a typical pulsing profile that we would use. where we control the on-off times of the lamp, and that gives us sort of a dwell time for our heating. And this individual pulse then can be repeated multiple times. So we would do this 15 times, say. And when we did this, we showed that photonic curing can be used to process transparent oxide materials just as well as an hour in a 500-degree tube furnace, if not even a little bit better. So you can see here that our field effect mobility is just slightly higher in our photonically cured samples. And when we look at that conversion, that oxide to hydroxide ratio, it's almost exactly the same in our photonically cured sample as it is in our furnace annealed control sample. So what we showed with this work was that these photonically cured TFTs can actually outperform the thermally annealed devices, and they can do that at a reduced curing time. And we're looking at only, about 30 milliseconds at an elevated temperature for photonic curing versus an hour in the tube furnace. So this was a really great result, but this is still curing TFTs on glass, right? We're trying to understand how the photonic curing works with these materials. And it turns out that doing this on plastic is much harder. That's something that we are still working on, because right now we can take the material to about 500 degrees, 590-ish, when we do this on glass, whereas when we have a plastic substrate, we find that the failure of the gate dielectric typically limits us to about 350 to 400 degrees. So that's something that we're still working on. The other thing that we explored was something that we sort of discovered by accident, actually. In making these devices, one of my students, when he was trying to see how much he could push on this processing, how much can I heat this up before it fails, what he noticed was that all of his larger gates were getting ablated and damaged, but his tiny alignment marks were still there. And all the simulation tools that were available to us at that time showed us that we're just looking at a 1D simulation. Basically, you're looking at a material stack. And so the simulation didn't care how big the device was. But what we were seeing was that we were observing that there was a difference in size. And so this is something that we wanted to explore, because the whole benefit of being able to do this large area processing is that you can do lots of devices at once. And so if they're going to be processed at different temperatures, that's something you have to design for. So the existing simulation tools that we had were just, looking at depth, looking at material thickness as a function of depth. So we developed a 3D simulation so that we could determine how that same optical pulse that would be applied over a large area is going to cure devices that may have different geometries. So this is the cross-section of our device. Again, we've got our metal gate. Our semiconductor is going to be up here. But we're simulating the temperature that's generated here in the gate on a glass substrate. So we've got 150 nanometers of our gate metal, and we have a 1 millimeter glass substrate, and we're going to simulate this 3D volume. And what we found here was exactly what we expected. When we run this simulation, we see a huge variation in the peak temperature, that curing temperature, with different gate geometries. So this is looking at the thermal map of gates that would have a different aspect ratio and a different area. So we looked at area, aspect ratio, and we also looked at shape. Does a rectangle behave differently than an ellipse? And the key point that I want you to see here is that, again, the same photonic carrying pulse is applied to all of these devices. And yet we see that a larger area device, so as we go up in area, we get higher peak temperatures. And as we go down in aspect ratio, so this device and this device have the same area, but this one is a rectangle with an aspect ratio of 10, and this is a square with an aspect ratio of 1. And you can see even with the same area, a high aspect ratio gate doesn't get as hot. And so all of a sudden, this large area tool, we really have to think about how the device dimensions are going to affect their curing temperature. Because as you can see here, we had some devices in this design of experiments that reached 450 degrees. And we designed the experiment such that some of them should have only a curing temperature of only about 200 degrees, which means they shouldn't work, right? Those devices are not going to get converted into the oxide that we want. And so it's really hard to measure the temperature on this time scale and as a function of depth. So instead of measuring the temperature, we know that the material conversion and the behavior of the TFT is very well correlated to that processing temperature. So we use the material conversion and the TFT performance to validate the model. So we say we know what 500-degree IGZO looks like in terms of its metal oxide composition. And so we can look at that and use that to help validate our model. So my student, Yasir, designed, after doing the simulation, he fabricated the devices with all these different gate shapes and sizes. So here's just a subset of them. We actually had about 15 different gate geometries that we simulated and fabricated here. But you can see we've got the squares with aspect ratio 1. We have long rectangles with aspect ratio 10. And then we had even longer ones with an aspect ratio of 25. And we looked at 5 different gate areas here. And again, remember that the gate area here is, we're not looking at how the size of the transistor itself, the channel dimensions are varying here, right? The size of the gate is just determining the temperature, and therefore it's determining how the material is cured. So these are fabricated with a tie-tongue gate, a bilayer high-K gate dielectric of aluminum oxide and hafnium oxide. We then spin coat our indium zinc oxide sol gel, and we did photonic curing and then the thermal annealing as our control. We etch and deposit our aluminum source drain at a top contact with tie-tongue. So this is what some of those devices actually look like, and we're trying to sort of highlight there where the gates are and where the semiconductor is going to be. So representative TFT characteristics shown here. This was for a device that was cured at a simulated temperature of about 400 degrees with a gate area of 25,000 square microns and an aspect ratio of 1. So this is one of our square devices. And you can see that the gate leakage here is pretty low because we've kept that temperature to only about 400. And we have some hysteresis in these devices, but not too bad. So this is sort of what a representative TFT characteristic would look like for a device that is cured at a reasonably high temperature. So if we look at the control devices, so these are our thermally annealed devices, all the different geometries, but they're all cured at 500 degrees. And these are our photonically cured devices. So you can see the temperature variation here. This is the peak temperature that was reached during curing. And what we're showing here is the field effect mobility of the transistors that we made with these 2 processes. And as you can see, the control devices, there's some variation in the mobility, but it's not going with a function, there's no trend with area or with aspect ratio. So here the different colors are representing the different gate areas. Whereas the photonically cured devices show exactly the trend that we would expect, where as you go up in area here from green, red, yellow, or from blue, red, yellow to green, we see a corresponding increase in that field effect mobility, which just helps us to see that, yes, the simulation that we did was valid. And indeed, there is clearly a difference in the material for these different devices, where the only difference is the size of the gate. The channel dimensions of the transistors were actually the same for all the devices. And we see something similar for the threshold voltage, which this is also expected when you increase the curing temperature of indium zinc oxide. You tend to see a more negative threshold voltage. That's because you have a higher concentration of oxygen vacancies that are formed, and it's harder to turn these devices off. So your threshold voltage gets more negative. So again, the trend that we see here is very consistent with the temperature that we simulated. In the hysteresis, we see the same thing as well. The hysteresis decreases as we get to those higher temperature curing devices. So all the transistor characteristics sort of line up with our simulation. And then we also looked at the XPS, so this conversion of the sol gels to the metal oxide. I included here a point that was measured off of a gate. So this would be a region where there is no metal underneath the semiconductor, but it's still cured, right? It's still hit with the flash lamp. And as you can see, there is almost no conversion here that happens at all. This huge peak over here in the purple, that's our hydroxide peak. And so we've done very little to convert this into the oxide phase here, right? So this is as expected. And then as we go from this medium-sized device to a larger device, you can see that we have a higher conversion to metal oxide, which again, it's the larger area, so it's heated more and we get that better conversion, and it's all consistent with our simulations and our TFTs. So the summary that we took away from this work is that the curing temperature during the photonic curing really strongly depends on both the area and the aspect ratio of the gates. So you can see here, the color is representing the peak curing temperature. So for these different devices, you're reaching very different temperatures, and that's going to have a huge impact on the device performance. So we can see the variation in the mobility going from only about 2 to a mobility of about 15 for some of these larger devices. And in this study, we're not trying to optimize the device performance, but we do want to know how this compares. And as I mentioned, this is a solution process method, but in the end, it's a thin film oxide, right? So we were curious to see how this compares to ALD films in particular. So these are several different ALD oxide films. So some are thermal, some are PEALD, and then our solution processed work is down here. So one of the key things to note here is that we're highlighting, this is the semiconductor curing temperature, and this is the substrate temperature. So it's the same when you do ALD, right? Your substrate has to be able to withstand this 400-degree RTA that happens to convert the semiconductor and get it into the characteristics you want. Versus the solution processed method with photonic curing, our substrate only got to about 120 here. So we're really interested in this for back end of line applications as well. And so this is something that we're exploring. In terms of the compatibility with large area substrates, spin coating is very easy. There's other ways you can do solution processing over large and flexible substrates as well. And the performance that we see is good. I would say it's not on par, right? It's not meeting the performance that we see with these ALD methods, but it's not terrible, right? And so when you have a requirement that says your substrate needs to stay much cooler, you're getting really, really nice performance for that type of application. Okay, so that's the curing part. So this is basically showing how we can use this flash lamp to heat the semiconductor film and get the electrical properties that we want. The other way that we use the same tool is for a process that we call photonic liftoff. So there are a lot of challenges in fabricating devices on plastic and flexible substrates. Most plastic films will warp. They're not really very resistant to solvents. Polyimide is sort of an outlier. So polyimide has a higher glass transition temperature, so it has a higher processing window. But a lot of flexible electronics work, they want to use inexpensive materials like PET and PEN. So these have much lower acceptable process temperatures. And so when you're trying to build devices, particularly when you're building multi-layer devices where you're trying to do lithography and align multiple lithography steps, that's where the fabrication on plastic is really problematic. So there's already, there are already methods like the laser liftoff that I mentioned, where you use the strategy of basically stabilizing the plastic film on a glass carrier. So this is, for example, a spin-on polyimide film. And then you would fabricate your devices fully on top of that plastic film while they are supported by the glass carrier, and then release it later. So there are different methods of doing that. The laser liftoff is one where you raster or scan a laser across the substrate. And we wanted to see if we could do the same thing with our photonic curing tool. So to do that, we had to introduce one extra layer here, and that's this light absorber layer. So remember that we are only going to heat where we have absorption. And I don't want to have a structure that looks like this, where if I were to shine light through the back of this glass, I don't want to rely on absorption in the polymer, and I don't really want to only heat here. So what we did is we introduced this light absorber layer. So it's just a metal coating on a glass substrate. And on top of that, we spin our polyimide and fabricate our devices. And so the PLO process uses a higher voltage and a shorter pulse, but it's otherwise fundamentally the same as the curing process. So we illuminate the device from the back. The light goes through the glass substrate, gets absorbed in our metal light absorber layer, and it actually ablates the polyimide at this interface here without heating the device layer up here. So we have, we looked at different thicknesses of this polyimide layer, and for 10 microns or so, that's enough to really keep your devices cool, while this gets to about 850 degrees, which is enough to ablate the polymer at the interface and allow it to lift off. And then the nice thing is that this substrate can be used over and over. It doesn't ash and it doesn't produce a bunch of carbon on this surface or anything, so we can actually just use that glass carrier over again. So the device fabrication, we start out with the light absorber layer, and then we spin on our polyimide. We cure the polyimide, and then we fabricate the TFTs. So these are basically, this is the same structure that we did before. We use that thermal annealing method here. And all of this process is done when the plastic is stabilized by that glass carrier. So then when we shine the light on the back of the device, the temperature profile looks like this. So this is the temperature as a function of time. And this black peak right here is showing the temperature at the interface between the light absorber layer and the polyimide. So this is the interface where we're getting that ablation. And the green line down here is the surface of the polymer where the device lives. So you can see that our device layer is only getting up to about 118 degrees. So again, this tool gives us the ability to have this big thermal gradient where we can heat the layer that we want to without heating the layer that we don't want to heat. So the process for this liftoff looks like this. This is the device flipped upside down. And we just suspend it on these two glass plates. This goes into the processing tray, and it's illuminated from the back. And then right after the pulses, this peels off really nicely. There's not a lot of sticking force. We were able to tune the parameters of this pulse, the pulse light, so that it comes off without a lot of residual stress in the film, so it's not rolling up on itself. And we get these nice flexible IGZO transistors. And when we model this, again, using a similar console model that we had used before, what we see is that the heat really does stay localized at this interface. So this yellow is the polyimide, and the heat is really localized here at the interface. So this is as a function of time. You can see that with increasing time, this heat dissipates very quickly. This is 5,000 microseconds here. And then the other thing we looked at was how the thickness of the polyimide matters, right? Because basically what that's doing is providing the thermal buffer between your ablation and your device layer. And so the thicker the polyimide layer is, you can make sure that your device temperature actually stays even lower if you want to. So what we saw is that when we fabricated these devices, we tested them before and after the liftoff. And you can see that these are basically falling right on top of each other. So we see a bit more hysteresis in these devices and a little bit lower mobility than what we saw in the previous devices because of that, because these are on plastic, as I mentioned. We can't push this temperature quite as high. But we see that there's basically no change before and after the liftoff. The mobility stays about the same. And when we take that lifted off device and we bend it to various radius of curvature here, and we measure the transfer and output characteristics, again, the IGZO TFTs, because of that amorphous structure, are very stable during that bending operation. The other thing that I want to point out about this method is that we get this, the ability to do very large area processing. So the tool that we have in my lab is a research tool. So it has a relatively small processing area. But what we can do with the production grade tools is they have multiple lamps lined up together, and they've designed the optics and the interior of the device so that you still get this very, very nice uniform illumination here. This is the illumination intensity, and you can see that the illumination intensity is very flat across this whole region, even though this is actually multiple lamps lined up to increase your processing area so that you can get even higher throughput in a commercial process. So our collaborators have also shown that you can do this same liftoff process with very large substrates. And so it's really nice that this is a very scalable process to these large area electronics. It's also nice because it works for a variety of polymers. So I mentioned that we have that light absorber layer. And so we're not relying on the polymer to absorb this photonic pulse that's coming from the back. It all gets absorbed in the metal. And so what that does is it decouples the light source from the polymer and its absorption profile. So all we need is the heat, right? And so we can do clear polyimide, we can do polyurethane, we can do different types of polyimide that have different properties. And they all work because it's sort of agnostic to the polymer that you're using. You're just heating because the metal itself is absorbing. So the last thing that I want to show you, and I think I have just enough time to do this, is I just want to very briefly highlight some of the other work that we're doing on the biomedical sensing area. So these are two devices that we have built. They don't have oxides. They're actually passive devices, but it, I think, highlights why we want to do flexible electronics specifically for biomedical sensing. So the first one is what we call an EC shell. So this is a large area transparent electrocorticography array. So what this is a device that we implant chronically into a mouse. So we remove part of their skull and we implant this little window that has transparent electrodes printed onto the window here. So you can see them in blue here. So this essentially becomes it replaces the skull, and then we can interface with the electronics. And we can use this for multimodal experiments in mice where we can look at the activity in the brain electrically through the electrocorticography array and also optically through calcium fluorescence. And those two modalities have very different temporal and spatial resolution, and they're very complementary. So by designing this flexible device that could actually curve over multiple regions of the brain, we were able to expand the window into the brain by about an order of magnitude compared to what had been done previously. And that allowed us to see multiple brain regions at once. So in this video, we're looking at first awake spontaneous recordings. And you can see this is a map of different regions of the brain. And what we're seeing here is these different colors are essentially indicating the activity level in that region of the brain. So this is from calcium fluorescence, and when a neuron fires, it fluoresces. And what we're seeing over here is the ECoG signals from some of these different channels that are indicated by the numbers here. And you can see that this is, because this is spontaneous activity, there's not a lot of pattern here. But when we anesthetize the mouse with ketamine xylazine, the ketamine produces these very regular sort of pulsing patterns that you can observe here. These are ketamine-induced oscillations, and you can see that both visually through this calcium fluorescence, but you can also see that pattern here in the ECoG. And so what's really interesting here is because the area of this window was so large, we can actually start to see, you know, where these are originating, and we can start to try to correlate what's happening electrically and optically and find out, are we actually getting the same information from these two modalities? And because the electrodes that we used were transparent, we were actually able to we can image individual cells. So each of these little bright colored spots is an individual neuron that we can track over time. So this is showing the fluorescence of an individual neuron. And the dashed line here is showing the outline of that transparent electrode. And you can see that we can actually monitor the activity of the neurons under the electrode just as well as the electrodes that are outside of that. So because this is a very large area implant, it allows us to look at individual neurons and also cortical networks in these awake behaving animals at the same time. So that's one example. The last example that I want to show you is completely different. So this is a wearable sensor that we are designing to measure biomarkers in the interstitial fluid. So the motivation for this project is to have a device that you could walk into the emergency room, or that a first responder or EMT might have in their bag. They rip it open and stick it on like a Band-Aid, and it has these tiny little microneedles that will penetrate into the top layer of the skin, into the epidermis, but not into the dermis. And the reason for that is because we can put coatings on these microneedles that will make them sensitive to particular biomarkers. And here we're looking at the ion concentration of the interstitial fluid that's in that epidermis. And we don't really want to get blood, and we don't really want to hit nerves. And so we keep this needle very short and keep it up in the upper layers of the skin. So we want to make this into a soft sort of wearable patch that then has these rigid functionalized microneedle electrodes. They have a nanoporous carbon layer and an ion sensitive coating on the outside. And we want to use those to do long-term continuous measurements of biomarkers in the interstitial fluid so that we can provide information for triage for trauma care. So this is what the first needles that we made look like. We actually used an acupuncture needle, coated that with the carbon and then with the ion sensitive membrane, and they look about like this. And what we found is that we can make very highly miniaturized potassium sensitive microneedles. We were looking here at 3 different types of carbon to find out how the nanostructure of the carbon influenced the stability of the sensor. Basically, we found that all 3 of them worked. And so we get this really nice, what's called Nernstian response, where the slope of this line as a function of the concentration is exactly what we expect to see for this system. So we were able to show that this worked for potassium. It also works for pH. And we're investigating this now for other applications, including wound healing as well. So we took these needles, and now we're in the process of building this into a flexible multi-needle array, where you can see this is a picture of the needle protruding out of a substrate. And then we have these individually printed traces so that we can access these microneedles individually. And we could functionalize one to be the reference electrode, one to be sensitive to calcium or potassium, another for pH. And in doing so, we could measure a host of different relevant ions with a single patch. So both of those applications rely on having flexible materials and systems that integrate soft and hard materials together. And sometimes that's actually the hardest part of those. So the takeaway points that I want you to get from this seminar, I hope, is that we have this photonic processing that we can use to cure and anneal materials. Here I'm showing it for oxides. But really, as long as you have the absorber layer and you've tailored the material underneath, you could use this for whatever material you want, right? And then the liftoff process is something that gives us the ability to make nice flexible devices. And those sensors are creating a lot of exciting opportunities for different biomedical device areas. So I will stop there and acknowledge funding from NSF, NIH, and several internal groups that we have at Minnesota, my collaborators, our facilities, and of course, all of my current and former group members. So I hope I've left enough time for some questions, and I'd be happy to take those now.